Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier has developed a bit of a pattern. He makes an announcement, brags about it for a few years, and then fails to deliver it. The people of Surrey were promised a new hospital, but there are $0 in the budget this year for that project. So they sneak the name into the budget and they just skip the details part. In fact, the NDP is so fuzzy on this project, they have 2 different completion dates offered up in the budget, which tells you pretty much where this project lies on the priority list as the NDP continue to deal with Surrey. So can the Premier tell the people of Surrey, first of all, why there's no money in the budget this year for that project, and why are there 2 different completion dates in the government's own documents?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I am delighted to talk to the Leader of the Opposition about Surrey, something that they neglected when they were in government for some 16 years. Of course, they didn't neglect residents of Surrey when they put a toll bridge in the middle of the community and said, only you will pay to cross this bridge. That was their approach to people in Surrey. Pay more, get less. We are building a hospital in Surrey. It will have a cancer centre. And I think the reason, Honourable Speaker, the reason that the BC Liberals couldn't find it in the budget is the only time a hospital in Surrey was mentioned in the BC Liberal budget was when they put a line item saying, this is the land that we sold where the hospital was supposed to go.
Leader of the Official Opposition on supplemental. Members, come to order, please. Leader of the Official Opposition on supplemental.
Well, let's be clear, and maybe the Premier should get his facts straight. After years of NDP neglect, it was members on this side of the House that expanded Surrey Memorial, and in fact, the Guru Nanak Emergency Department, and it was this side of the House that built the Jim Pattison Outpatient Centre. This side actually delivered on its promises. So sadly, that's not the only promise that the Premier has broken when it comes to Surrey. And I quote, we have to have a total removal of these portables over the next 4 years and start by reducing them by half in the first 2 years, end quote. Well, that was 5 years ago. And let's see what the Premier's managed to deliver. Well, guess what? That hasn't happened. In fact, the number of portables has actually increased by over 30%. So neither the throne speech or the budget make any reference to that promise. Once again, another promise made, bragged about, and disappears. So can the Premier stand up today and explain to the parents, the teachers, and the residents of Surrey what happened to the promise he made 4 years ago about eliminating portables?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Was it 4 years ago? Was it 5 years ago? They don't really know. They don't really care. They just want to make noise, not provide services for people. Not to provide services for people.
Members.
The fastest.
Members will come to order. You're losing very precious time, members. Okay?
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I was reflecting that there are more members in the Surrey caucus on this side of the House than there are members sitting on that side of the House right now. But that's the fastest growing region in the province, Honourable Speaker. You know this full well. More kids coming into schools in Surrey than anywhere else in British Columbia. What did the former government do between 2011 and 2016? Zero. 1,000 new kids a year, every year for 5 years. Not one portable was removed. They were stacking them up like cordwood, Honourable Speaker. What did we do? We built 2,700 spaces. We've worked with the school board. We've worked with the city of Surrey to fast-track approval processes. We weren't just taking money out of tolls. We were taking money and putting it into schools, putting it into better outcomes for kids. We're unapologetic about that, Honourable Speaker. And again, the reason there are more Surrey members on this side of the House than there are members on that side today is because we are delivering on the promises that we made.
Members, are we interested in asking questions and answers? If we are, then we'll continue. Otherwise, there is no need to. Member for Fraser-Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. School boards have been warning this government that they face significant deficits without support. Students and staff want to know COVID safety standards will be maintained when school resumes in the fall. Parents want to be assured the support for their children who may have fallen slightly behind remains in place. And what does this Premier do? He cuts $55 million from the budgets of school boards. Can the Premier tell us whether custodians or learning assistants will be fired because of his budget cuts?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Only the BC Liberals could look at an emergency boost in funding for school districts during a pandemic and then call it a cut. And you know why, Mr. Speaker? Because that's all they know is to cut programs for children in our schools. Everything to them looks like a cut, Mr. Speaker. We are putting more into the education system this year than we ever have before, Mr. Speaker, and there's more support for pandemic, for making sure that the schools are clean, that our children are safe, that the teachers are safe, and that all the staff in school districts right around the province are safe. That's been a priority from our government from day one of this pandemic, and it's continuing to be a priority for us.
Member for Fraser-Nicola on supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it seems this government is predicting a return to normal, that in September everything will be magically better. Staff, teachers, and parents want to know that schools will be safe. They want to know PPE will be there, that staff resources will be there, and that the government has their back. And in School District 61, Victoria, they know the Premier doesn't. Trustees are looking at having to cut music programs and youth and family counsellors. Again, to the Premier, who's going to be given a pink slip in June in order to deal with these cuts?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Budget 2021 protects people's health and their livelihoods, and it builds on the resilience of British Columbians, the resilience that we have seen for the last year. It has been absolutely amazing to see people take care of each other and to have a government that has been taking care of British Columbians since this pandemic began. We did that in March. We've been doing that all last spring, all last summer, all fall, and right now in the spring, and we will as long as there is a pandemic to be dealt with. This government has people's backs.
Leader of Third Party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Yesterday's budget saw this government announce $330 million aimed at addressing the overdose crisis. Treatment beds and supervised consumption sites are long-term measures, but they do not immediately address our current reality. Over 900 people have died since safe supply measures were promised by this government in September, and that number is only current to the end of February. And yet in this budget, we've seen no directive that government is following up on that commitment to provide alternatives to an illicit and poisonous street supply. Experts and drug user advocates are distraught that this government's budget has gone back on their promise to implement regulated safe supply. My question, Honourable Speaker, through you, is to the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. Will her government immediately fund a regulated safe supply in order to stop the unnecessary deaths of 5 people a day in British Columbia?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. that British Columbia is leading the country in providing prescription alternatives, safer supply, is something that we are leading the country on. That there has been a 400% increase in people that have been prescribed safe supply since the pandemic began, has saved lives, and yet the death toll has been terrible. There are the announcement ahead of the budget, the week before the budget, of $45 million to continue to implement the life-saving harm reduction and substance use supports, which again have saved lives during a terrible year of loss of life, is something that we wanted to signal early so that those on the front line were able to continue and expand on those new measures. There are items in the budget for continuing to separate people from the toxic drug supply, from the mass poisoning that's happening across British Columbia. And I can say with absolute confidence and convey to those who have been advocating for a continued expansion of safe supply that there is budget provision for them. And I'll be talking with stakeholders in the coming days about the continued expansion and the deepening commitment of our government to lead the country and to separate people from the toxic drug supply during a terrible public health emergency.
Leader of Third Party on supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. When asked yesterday about the absence of mention of safe supply in the budget, the Minister of Finance said that this government is expanding treatment beds and consumption sites because, quote, we know what works and works so well. This government also knows that regulated safe supply, accessible to people when they need it, is what has been committed to and what is needed right now to stop the deaths from a toxic drug supply. It isn't an either or. As a continuum of care is set up, 5 people are dying per day. We need to couple long-term measures with immediate, regulated, safe supply that recognizes now more than ever, because of COVID-19, people are isolated and facing an increasingly toxic drug supply. We need proactive measures that are combined with long-term solutions. My question, Honourable Speaker, is again to the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. She says that there will be funds in the budget. Can she provide specific details about what we can expect to see for funding regulated safe supply in this province immediately?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Anybody that's watching, I want you to know that in addition to prescribed safer supply, our commitment, as exhibited in the budget, $500 million of mental health and addiction support. It's unprecedented in British Columbia's history. And on responding to the overdose crisis, it includes building new treatment beds. It includes standing up additional supervised consumption sites. Across the continuum of care, we are working on every front and working hard. Here are the specifics on prescribed safer supply. $22.6 million over 3 years includes leveraging existing programs, creating new programs to provide expanded regional access hubs, ongoing evaluation of implementation and clinical impacts on the health and safety of patients, and development of clinical protocols and guidance based on emerging evidence. And again, to those who have been advocating and doing the very hard work of developing protocols, the first in Canada, I'll be in touch with them in coming days about the specifics of how that budget commitment will be spent.
Member for Peace River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we saw a completely botched budget put forward by the Premier. There's no real support for businesses, no support for workers that are impacted by this pandemic. We've all heard the stories. It's too bad the Premier is not listening to the people of British Columbia right now. Look, it's cold comfort to the restaurant sector that was banking on new supports to make it through the COVID restrictions. Despite this glaring oversight, the Premier's sitting on over $1 billion in unused COVID funds. $1 billion he's sitting on. Will the Premier direct that funding today to support the businesses and workers that have been completely ignored in this budget?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to get up on my feet to talk about a fabulous budget that is here to support British Columbians, their health, protecting people's health, protecting their livelihoods, and, Mr. Speaker, building out and preparing for a recovery that we know is coming. We know it's coming because we have a vaccine rollout that is playing out, that is making a difference for British Columbians. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind everybody that we have been in this pandemic for over a year, and we've always been there to support British Columbians. To date, Mr. Speaker, we offered, just to remind everyone, $1,000 a worker benefit went to 600,000 British Columbians whose jobs were impacted last year. We were the only province to provide a rental supplement, Honourable Speaker, for those who had to pay rent and were worried about it.
Members.
A recovery benefit that was received by over 2.5 million British Columbians, Mr. Speaker. We've had business supports, the small and medium-sized business grant program that is helping people, and those in the tourism industry, they're eligible for up to $45,000 to help make the difference, to help provide a bridge until better days ahead, Mr. Speaker. There's absolutely a lot more in this budget. I know we're going to be getting more questions, and I look forward to that coming up.
Member for Peace River South on supplemental.
It would have been nice if the finance minister actually talked about this budget. Everything she just talked about was last year, stuff that all three parties in this House worked together to try to help people in the COVID crisis. And again, the government failed to even get that money out the door then. We're talking about people who are in crisis now. They're still in crisis because this government failed to help them when this House worked together for that exact reason. The circuit breaker grant was originally supposed to support a 3-week shutdown. That 3 weeks is actually ending this week. The shutdown now has been extended for possibly 2 months, if not more, shutting down businesses, putting more people out of work. Again, the minister avoided completely the question. The minister, the premier, are sitting on $1 billion of unallocated funding, which is 20 times what the circuit breaker grant is. The Premier can fix that mistake today. Will he direct that $1 billion go out, increase the circuit breaker grant, make sure that money gets out the door now to help people who are affected today?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to get back on my feet and talk about the $127 million that have gone out to the small business recovery grants, up to $45,000, as well as the circuit breaker relief grant, up to $10,000. And also, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to talk about the PST on new equipment machinery, waiving that that's in this budget, and the impact.
Members.
And the impact and the savings that are going to be going to businesses as a result of that investment, Mr. Speaker. Again, Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to listen to businesses. I know that my colleague, the Minister for Small Business, has been engaging with the businesses that are most impacted. We have been there. We have demonstrated our commitment to the business community to be there for them. We're going to keep being there for them, Mr. Speaker. That's our commitment to them.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, only in NDP land would they celebrate taking 2 years, essentially, to get critical supports out to businesses that are struggling, because that's what's going to happen here. The dollars in the BC Recovery Grant and the Circuit Breaker Grant, these were dollars that were approved over a year ago. The programs were established just before the last election that the Premier felt necessary to call. And we're sitting here today, and they're so excited about their progress that they've had to push the program out by an extra year because they can't figure out how to get the money out the door. It's pathetic. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Premier also failed.
Members. Let's not have side conversations, please. Let's hear the question. Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if the small business owners, those restaurateurs, those in the service industry, those hospitality businesses, those tourism businesses, those hardworking British Columbians around the province could hear the members opposite laughing today when we're asking critical questions about what this government is doing and what they're not doing to support small business, I think they'd be pretty darn disappointed in their government. So, Mr. Speaker, the Premier also offered no hope and no vision for British Columbians and their jobs in this budget. That being said, he has put a plan in front of British Columbians that grows the size of government massively. And in fact, one can only be astounded when you look at the budget documents and you see on page 34, and you see it clearly indicated that the government is basing its recovery on taxpayer-funded public sector jobs, which have increased by 60,000 positions over the past year. You heard that right, 60,000 positions in 1 year. Meanwhile, the private sector is still trying to recover 43,000 jobs that are lost today compared to 1 year ago. So my question to the Premier is this: will the Premier immediately table in this House a private sector jobs plan?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's so interesting to listen to the members of the other side sort of jump around with their anxiety and their stress, Mr. Speaker, because they seem to sort of forget, they seem to...
Members, I think the question was already asked.
That it's really important, I think, to listen to what others are saying. So I want to note that precisely. So I want to note, Surrey Board of Trade has said we were happy to hear that there are financial commitments in the service plan for trade and industry development, small business and economic development, and the strategic investment fund called NBC. This is from the Surrey Board of Trade. They like what they heard, Mr. Speaker. They value what they heard, Mr. Speaker. On the other hand, the members opposite, they're just grasping at straws, Mr. Speaker, because they don't like it that the business community is happy with what we are presenting in our budget.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson on supplemental.
Well, I'm not sure if the Minister of Finance could be more dismissive than that, more dismissive of the thousands of British Columbians who are sitting at home today wondering if they're going to get called back to work anytime soon, wondering if they're going to be able to pay their bills. In fact, 53% of British Columbians aren't sure, or they're $200 away from paying their bills at the end of the month, Mr. Speaker. And we hear today dismissive responses from the Minister of Finance about anxiety and stress. You're darn right British Columbians have a lot of anxiety and stress because this government hasn't stepped up to support them. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister responsible for the minister...
Members, member will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister responsible for economic recovery actually got no new funding in his budget in order to help businesses in need. Clearly, his ministry is not a priority for the Premier. And in addition to that, despite women and youth being impacted most by this pandemic, the Premier has no jobs plan for them either. This is something that we've been calling for months. So my question to the Premier is this: will the Premier fix this mistake? Will he table both a private sector jobs plan and a jobs plan focused on youth and women?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's interesting to listen to the members opposite talk with such disdain for teachers and healthcare workers in our province, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker,
members,
one of their own...
Members. Minister. Minister, just take a seat, please. Members, I understand heckling is more tempting, but heckling is not going to produce anything. Shall we call this a heckling session then instead of question period? Okay. Minister will continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's really, I guess, I guess, disappointing that, that we get heckled every time we try to answer, a particular question. It's very, very disappointing. And I want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that in this budget you see tremendous... Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to answer the questions. The question that I have is if they're prepared to listen to the answer. In this budget, Mr. Speaker, we are investing heavily in youth of British Columbia, with co-op opportunities, with job training, with upskilling opportunities, 30 micro-credentialing programs, Mr. Speaker. We know that youth have been hit hard in this pandemic, and that's why we are investing in them. And for women, we have tripled the childcare budget since we formed government, Mr. Speaker, because that's the biggest difference for women.
Member for West Vancouver Capilano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This two-term government is abandoning families and working mothers at an astonishing rate. In 2017, this Premier promised $10 a day daycare, and this promise was the underpinning of the Childcare BC plan. Then he promised it again, and yesterday we saw his incompetence on full display. All that's being referenced in this budget is to convert more spaces that already exist into the pilot program. No new spaces. According to Sharon Gregson from the $10 a day Daycare Coalition, this budget did not, quote, deliver the system BC families and educators were promised in the recent election. Can the Premier tell parents to whom he broke his word, not once but twice, when will universal childcare be available to all British Columbians?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, but they start heckling before I even start answering. I mean, this is sort of getting a little bit, maybe, they'll have the answer, or maybe they prefer to hear it. So our budget more than doubles the number of $10 a day prototype centers. And you know what that means, Mr. Speaker? That means that 4,000 more affordable spaces for families here in British Columbia. You know what else we're doing, Mr. Speaker, in this budget? We are doubling the wage enhancement for early childhood educators to $4 an hour. That brings their median wage to $25 an hour. When we started in government, Mr. Speaker, they were barely making $15, $16 an hour. And because we care about making sure that there's quality, affordable, and accessible childcare for all British Columbians.
Member for West Vancouver Capilano supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find that an interesting answer considering the fee cap that was recently imposed on the childcare providers, which is one of the biggest things to push down ECE salaries. So that is you're going to have to make up for the $4 an hour. The Premier made a promise of $250 million in new spending on childcare each year. He committed to a separate capital program for daycares, and instead this Premier has delivered $233 million over 3 years. That's $83 million, not $250. Emily Gallick is the Executive Director of the Early Childhood Educators in British Columbia, and she says, quote, "The progress is so minimal, it does not meet the needs of families or educators as they try to recover from this pandemic," unquote. Can the Premier tell us why he has abandoned his commitment and blown it for parents and families expecting more?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely fascinating to listen to members of the other side who finally discovered that childcare is a necessity for the economy. For years, they neglected childcare in this province, Mr. Speaker. They ignored the needs of families, they ignored the needs of women, and they ignored the needs of children. It took them 4 years to create as many spaces as we created in our first 10 months in government, Mr. Speaker. And I'm happy happy to say with this budget, Mr. Speaker, we are helping almost 2,000 more families access supported child development programs. And that's going to make a real difference for those families that have children with special needs in childcare, in the childcare system, Mr. Speaker. That's going to make a difference for these families because we care about families, we care about children, and we want to make sure that it's there for women to work and contribute to the economy and participate in our economic recovery.
Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's very interesting listening to the avoidance of the questions today by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting how the language has changed, how they don't really want to talk about universal $10 a day daycare anymore. They don't want to talk about numbers. They talk about doubling. A doubling of a failed target already that was only a few thousand spaces when it should have been fully implemented by now, from a promise made twice by this Premier over the last 4 years. The NDP have only opened 10% of the promises, the spaces they promised. That means a doubling gets you to 20% of your promise after 5 years. It's not good enough. There's still 80% of the public looking for the childcare they were promised by this Premier not once, but twice. A couple of quotes. This provincial budget does not deliver on promises of childcare. That's from Paul Kershaw. Today's BC budget has thrown cold water on the good childcare news we heard from the federal government. That's from the Coalition of Childcare Advocates. Finance Minister Robinson's first budget does not deliver the system BC's families and educators were promised in the recent election. Coalition of Childcare Advocates. BC's government must now improve on its lackluster 2021 budget. That's from Sharon Gregson. And finally, BC shouldn't wait for federal funds to arrive before making more significant improvements to childcare in our province. When will this Premier stand up and actually deliver on his twice now delivered promise in 2 different elections and ensure residents of British Columbia they will have affordable $10 a day, fully accessible childcare in British Columbia? Now, not another 5-6 years from now.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, when our government's Childcare BC plan began with a historic $2 billion investment for childcare in the first 3 years. And when you're building a system, Mr. Speaker, it does take some time for sure. And doubling the and over 36,000
Members.
36,000 families now receive childcare for $10 a day or less. We are doubling that, Mr. Speaker. And I'm so glad that the member opposite mentioned that the federal government is finally at the table, because you know what that means for us, Mr. Speaker? It means that we're going to be able to move faster.
Members will come to order.
Mr. Speaker, with the federal government that just on Monday announced that they are finally participating in childcare, we're going to be able to deliver much faster. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The bell ends the question period.